Dịch viên bác sĩ Nguyễn Hoàng Long. Để bắt đầu chương trình, xin trân trọng kính mời chủ tọa, Thạc sĩ bác sĩ Đinh Anh Tuấn và Tiến sĩ bác sĩ Lê Quang Thanh tiến về phía bàn chủ tọa và điều khiển chương trình. Xin trân trọng kính mời.
Trong cái phiên khai mạc, tức là phiên toàn thể thì có hai bài báo cáo hết sức là ấn tượng và rất là chuyên sâu của hai chuyên gia được xem là số 1 trên thế giới trong lĩnh vực này. Và hiện nay thì hai chuyên gia đang theo dõi trực tiếp online, còn các bài báo cáo thì đã được ghi hình trước. Cũng mong là quý vị đại biểu chúng ta tập trung vì có rất nhiều quan điểm mới trong hai bài báo cáo này. Đầu tiên thì xin kính mời ban tổ chức trình chiếu cái báo cáo của giáo sư Abu Hamad Amfred. Ông là quyền chủ tịch, hiệu trưởng và trưởng khoa của Đại học Y khoa Đông Virginia. Ông là nguyên chủ tịch Hội Y học bà mẹ và bào thai của Hoa Kỳ và là Hội siêu âm của Hoa Kỳ. Ông sẽ trình bày ngày hôm nay về chuyên đề hai chậm tăng trưởng trong tử cung, tính hợp lý của các khuyến cáo từ Hội Y học bà mẹ và bào thai của Hoa Kỳ. Xin kính mời.
My name is Alfred Abu Hamad, and I will be presenting today on the fetal growth restriction, the role of ultrasound in diagnosis and management. The definition of fetal growth restriction that is most commonly used is a fetus that failed to reach its biological growth potential. Most commonly due to placental dysfunction, but also could be due to maternal or fetal factors. Fetal growth restriction is a very complex problem. There are various published definitions. We have still today poor detection rates. There are limited preventive or treatment options available to us. There are multiple associated morbidities, and now we know over large data of epidemiological studies that fetal growth restriction has a significant impact on our long-term health. We know that the impact of fetal growth restriction, when it's related to placental insufficiency, is undernutrition, fetal hypoxia, volume pressure overload, epigenetic changes that happen within the fetus and the placenta, and cardiovascular remodeling that impact long-term survival and long-term chronic diseases at the organ level, at the tissue level, and at the subcellular level. There has been various treatments that have been tried over the years in order to treat and improve outcome in fetal growth restriction in various modalities, randomized trials or others. I can summarize by saying this long list of the slide has not been shown to show any benefit in one way or another. We also know that placental dysfunction leading to fetal growth restriction and other diseases in pregnancy such as preeclampsia, preterm labor, and others appears to have its origin in the first trimester. So what we know now is that placental dysfunction, whether at the level of the placenta itself, maternal or fetal, will lead to alterations in placental development, which can lead to placental dysfunction and then leads to diseases that are manifested later on in pregnancy with fetal growth restriction, preeclampsia, and others. The research currently is trying to identify in early gestations markers of placental disease that can predict diseases that manifest itself later on, with the hope and goal of trying to reduce the prevalence of those diseases by intervening early on in pregnancy. There has been many terminology that have been used in fetal growth restriction. So we use the term fetal growth restriction, we've used the term small for gestational age, we've used the term intrauterine growth restriction. There are several definitions. One of the definitions that has been proposed based on the Delphi procedure is to use what you can see here, an early fetal growth restriction, gestational age less than 32 weeks, And here, an abdominal circumference estimated weight below the third percentile, or abnormal umbilical artery Doppler, or the presence of one of these three combinations. And late fetal growth restriction is a gestation age at or greater than 32 weeks, again with these definitions. So it's a combination of Doppler findings with biometric findings, primarily related to the decision. Now, this is a complex problem, and there are various definitions that have been proposed in many localities across the world. So SGA has been defined as estimated fetal weight less than 10th percentile with a normal Doppler. Fetal growth restriction based on the Duffy procedure is an estimated fetal weight less than the 10th percentile with abnormal Doppler, or estimated fetal weight less than the 3rd percentile. The problem with this terminology, even though it makes sense physiologically and does identify fetuses that actually have placental disease, it is clinically challenging because it requires, first of all, the combination of Dopplers and biometric measurements, and then given fluctuations in estimation of fetal weight with the moderate reliability of ultrasound, you can have a fetus that's classified as SGA with an estimated fetal weight at the 8th percentile in normal Doppler. That comes back with an abnormal Doppler right at the cutoff of abnormality. Then we call that a fetus fetal growth restricted. And then on follow-up ultrasound, the Doppler becomes normal because it was really around the cutoff, and then do we classify as SGA. So that's a complex issue. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, in an attempt to standardize terminology, had proposed to use fetal growth restriction for all sonographically estimated fetal weight that are below a critical threshold, and to use the term small for gestational age for actual birth weight for gestational age that's below a threshold. Although this definition physiologically may not make sense, but from a clinical perspective, it appeared to make sense because it then separates clearly what's an SGA fetus, the newborn that is an estimated fetal weight less than a 10th after birth, and the fetal growth restriction, an estimated fetal weight less than a critical threshold before birth, prenatal. And we recommend that you follow this definition in your clinical evaluation, given its clinical importance. So how do we estimate fetal weight? You do biometric measurements, regression equations generate an estimated sonographic estimated fetal weight, and then we use reference charts to determine what critical cutoff do we use to really define this fetus's weight as growth restricted or not. You know that estimating fetal weight, the formula for weight is size times density. And what we do on ultrasound is actually we measure size. By measuring the head circumference, abdominal circumference, femur length, we use regression equations to determine the weight of the baby. Now, we don't have the ability on ultrasound to account for density. And density of tissue varies between fetuses based on the presence of diabetes or other comorbidities. So, although ultrasound is reliable in its ability to estimate fetal weight, but we will not get to the perfect formula given this discrepancy, given our inability to assess density of fetuses. I wanted to present you this concept to highlight that there are inherent limitations in the concept of estimating fetal weight based on ultrasound evaluation. This is a Hadlock study that was done in 1991 on 392 white women in Texas and generated this regression equation that you see right here. And it appears that it has stood the test of time, is most commonly used around the world now for estimating fetal weight on ultrasound. Now, this study by Dudley has looked at many formulas and trying to assess which formula is better than others in estimating fetal weight. Comparing multiple equations, it appears clearly that there is no consistently superior method of assessment for fetal weight. And there are similar systematic and random errors between, and there is wide intra- and inter-observer variability between these formulas. So, in order to improve your estimation of fetal weight, make sure that you follow the criteria for your biometric measurements. Make sure that you have consistency in your measurement using multiple measurements to assess each parameter of the fetus. There also have been multiple recent growth curves that have been proposed. Intergrowth 21 is a growth curve that was done in 8 countries around the world. And what they were trying to attempt to identify is how normal fetuses should grow in normal conditions. And what they came up with is biometric charts for BPD, head circumference, and arm circumference, and femur length. They found no ethnical variations with a single universal standards. And they found that fetuses grow normally under normal conditions with a one size that fits all. The NICHD had studies in 12 US sites recently in the US to generate growth curves, more modern growth curves, and they calculated estimated fetal weight from the head circumference, arm circumference, and femur length using the Hadlock 1985 formula. And what the NICHD curves came up with is that they found actually significant variations by estimated fetal weight based on race, with, as you can see in this graph, with the white population having a steeper or higher curve than the others. And that if you adjust by racial or ethnic specific standards, you will improve the precision in evaluating fetal growth. The WHO had international studies in 10 countries around the world. Here also they calculated estimated fetal weight using the Hadlock 1985 formula. And what they found actually is that fetal sex had a sizable effect on estimating fetal weight. Male fetuses appeared to grow heavier than female fetuses in utero. And then they also found estimated fetal weight differed significantly by race and ethnicity beyond 20 weeks, similar to the NICHD standards, what they found. Now, should we switch to recent growth curves? Well, to do so, we need to show evidence that recent growth curves actually improves our detection of fetal growth restriction after birth. This is a study in the population in France, comparing the Hadlock formula with the intergrowth formula. And if you could see what they found, that the intergrowth formula actually had more systemic errors, had detected less of the estimated fetal weight within 10% and detected less of the estimated fetal weight within 15%. And the authors concluded that the Hadlock estimated fetal weight formula was more accurate than intergrowth formula for fetuses delivered between 22 and 34 weeks. And their conclusion supports continued use of the Hadlock formula in France and raises the question about the applicability of the intergrowth intra-uterine standards. Here's another study comparing the Hadlock fetal growth standard to the NICHD standard. And basically what they found that despite the publication of the Hadlock formula more than 25 years ago, it is superior to the NICHD formula as it detected more severe neonatal morbidity and detected more SGA at birth. So with this information that we have, it makes sense to suggest to continue to use the population standard of Hadlock for determination of fetal weight percentiles until evidence shows that newer formulas are superior. And we also recommend to continue the research in that arena to try to improve our ability to identify fetal growth restriction prenatally. Now, are there different phenotypes of fetal growth restriction? Well, if you look, a lot of studies have been done trying to define an early or late phenotype of fetal growth restriction. And indeed, there may be some significant differences between the two. First, early fetal growth restriction defined as the diagnosis of fetal growth restriction at less than 32 weeks. It is not as common as late fetal growth restriction, defined with the diagnosis at 32 weeks or greater. Here you have more placental disease, more abnormal Dopplers, more association with preeclampsia than late fetal growth restriction, and certainly a higher morbidity and mortality than late fetal growth restriction. So just to summarize this, early fetal growth restriction is a perfusion and a diffusion problem. So it's a vascular problem and placental disease problem. Here you have high resistance abnormal diffusion. You have problems with regards to the spiral arteries coming in and their effect on the placental disease. Your uterine artery is abnormal, maternal spiral artery is abnormal, certainly your umbilical artery is abnormal, and your ductus venosus gets significantly affected in late stages of the disease. Late onset fetal growth restriction is primarily a diffusion problem. It's the problem that happens later on in pregnancy. Here you have abnormal diffusion, but the vascular key is fairly well developed. Uterine arteries may be abnormal, umbilical may be abnormal, but less commonly than early onset fetal growth restriction. And certainly it appears that the middle cerebral artery is more affected in the late onset than early onset, and we'll talk about that later. So with all this as a background, how do we diagnose fetal growth restriction? Here's a table from various countries around the world to show you that most use an estimated fetal weight less than the 10th percentile as the approach to make the diagnosis. And if you look how important is the abdominal circumference in estimating fetal and in the diagnosis of fetal growth restriction, this is a meta-analysis of various studies looking at the prediction of small and large for gestational age fetuses at birth. And you can see that the abdominal circumference is comparable to the estimated fetal weight to predict both SGA and LGA. So we should be looking to incorporating the abdominal circumference as part of our diagnostic evaluation for fetal growth restriction. Here's another study in a systematic review and meta-analysis showing that the abdominal circumference is significantly important in making the diagnosis of fetal growth restriction. So we recommend to make the diagnosis of fetal growth restriction is to use a sonographic estimated fetal weight less than the 10th percentile and or an abdominal circumference less than the 10th percentile as your entry criteria to the diagnosis. We also diagnose to use the term severe fetal growth restriction for sonographic estimated fetal weight less than the 3rd percentile, and to subclassify fetal growth restriction into early when the diagnosis is before 32 weeks and late when the diagnosis is at or greater than 32 weeks. So it's important to note also when we talk about these all diagnostic parameters that when you look at high-risk pregnancies, there are tests that can identify and predict the presence of high-risk pregnancies, but what is really important to incorporate into your management is the test not only identifies, but also improves outcome. And I think that becomes important when we talk about various parameters that are used clinically in the evaluation of the fetus fetal growth restriction. I think to incorporate into a national guideline a new parameter, a new Doppler, we have to make sure that not only it identifies who are the fetuses that are going to get in trouble, but if we use it, does it really improve outcome? So let's talk a little bit about clinical management of early onset fetal growth restriction. It's really an important balance between prematurity and stillbirth. When do we bail out before the baby dies in utero and provide for a better outcome than leaving the fetus within the pregnancy? Now, gestational age is the most important prognostic factor. Indeed, in the severe prematurity time, 23, 24 to about 28, 29 weeks. And the balance is important up until 32 weeks. Beyond 32 weeks, prematurity risks and complications are so low that it's important to bail out if there are indications and criteria to do so. It's also important to note that maternal hypertensive disease is one of the most important independent determinants of poor outcomes in early onset fetal growth restriction. And indeed, showing and making a diagnosis of early onset fetal growth restriction, you need to be very cognizant of the association with maternal hypertensive disease, such as severe preeclampsia and complications, and monitor those pregnancies for the development of such. And if you look at the Truffle study, the Truffle is a randomized trial that was done, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, in Europe on the role of ductus venosus. You see the impact of hypertension on survival rates. This is the curve for pregnancies that did not have hypertension, and you can see progressively gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, and HELLP syndrome drift this curve to the left, increasing neonatal complications and reducing survival. So the presence of hypertensive disease is a very, very important concept. And indeed, it was complicated pregnancy in 50% when patients were recruited into the study and about 70%. So remember, hypertension is significantly associated with early onset fetal growth restriction and certainly worsens the outcome. Now, what's the role of the umbilical artery Doppler in early onset fetal growth restriction? So umbilical artery increase impedance is primarily resultant from obliteration of small muscular arteries in the tertiary stent line. To have absent or reversed end-diastolic velocity, you need more than 70% placental obliteration. So it's a fairly advanced stage of placental disease. And it appears the Doppler progression is slow, takes about, on average, these are retrospective data, 26 days to go from normal to increased, then 12 days to absent, and 4 days to reversed. I will caution that this is retrospective data that is based on more complicated pregnancies probably than what we see prospectively. So, the use of umbilical artery Doppler has been shown in 18 trials in association with high-risk pregnancy to reduce perinatal death and obstetrical intervention. So there's a lot of evidence, strong evidence to suggest that the umbilical artery Doppler has a significant role in the management of high-risk pregnancies, and we deduce from that in the management of fetal growth restriction. How about in normal pregnancies? In normal pregnancies, systematic review of 5 trials show that using of umbilical artery Doppler does not improve maternal neonatal outcomes. So do not use umbilical artery Doppler in normal pregnancies as a screening modality for the presence of disease. When you look at absent end-diastolic velocity, and this is a list of studies that have looked at that, you will see that the risk of fetal death when you have absent end-diastolic velocity is about 3, the odds ratio is somewhere around 3.5. That risk of fetal death is greater than neonatal mortality at 33 to 34 weeks. So this is the balance that is used between when you have absent end-diastolic velocity, everything else being okay, when do you bail out of this pregnancy? It appears that the evidence suggests 33 to 34 weeks is the time to do so. For reversed end-diastolic velocity, this is about an odds ratio of 7. That odds ratio shows that this time frame is somewhere around 30 to 32 weeks. So with reversed end-diastolic velocity, clearly it's important to consider bailing out around 30 to 32 weeks of gestation. In late onset fetal growth restriction, umbilical artery Doppler does not predict the presence of placental disease at adverse outcome. I think to understand this, late onset fetal growth restriction is probably a milder form of early onset fetal growth restriction, where there's enough placental circulation to show normal umbilical artery Doppler still until later stages of the disease. And the presence of normal umbilical artery Doppler in late onset does not rule out placental disease. This is why people suggest the use of the MCA Doppler, because it appears to be abnormal at about 15 to 20% of late onset fetal growth restriction based on the presence of hypoxia. So if you look at this graph, the distribution between early onset and late onset fetal growth restriction, you see that abnormality in the umbilical artery Doppler is much, much more common in late onset fetal growth restriction. So we recommend umbilical artery Doppler as an essential component of fetal surveillance and fetal growth restriction. We do not recommend it as a screening tool in low-risk pregnancy. We also recommend that the umbilical artery Doppler pulsatility index resistance for ST ratio, that most people use the PI, especially in Europe, in the United States, and more people use ST ratio. We're going to show some data in the future to show the importance of these indices. But now the guideline states you can use any of them to quantify the waveform, and we define an abnormal umbilical artery Doppler by the presence of indices greater than the 95th percentile, or the presence of absent or reverse flow in the umbilical artery. If the umbilical artery Doppler is normal, we recommend to repeat it in 1 to 2 weeks and increase intervals afterwards. Why? There's some retrospective data that suggests that the deterioration could happen in 1 to 2 weeks post-diagnosis. Again, this is based on retrospective data. The presence of decreased end-diastolic velocity or the presence of severe fetal growth restriction, estimated fetal rate less than the 3rd percentile, repeat the Dopplers weekly, absent end-diastolic velocity at least twice a week, reverse end-diastolic velocity. The use of Doppler is not really helpful anymore because you've reached the end stage here. At least 1 to 2 times daily, use the cardiotocography, such as non-stress tests. Some people use biophysical profiles. So most of the time, patients with absent and certainly with reverse end-diastolic velocity need to be in the hospital because of the need for increased surveillance. What's the role of ductus venosus in early onset fetal growth restriction? Certainly the ductus venosus abnormality is related because of increased end-diastolic pressure in the right ventricle, because of increased downstream resistance, Cardiac stiffness becomes more because of the effect of hypoxemia. So when the atrial kit contracts, more blood flow goes down the IVC, and you see that as reverse flow in the ductus venosus. So it's certainly a fairly advanced stage of fetal compromise. So here's the normal waveform. This is the atrial kit portion right here. Normally you should see forward flow. This is the abnormal ductus venosus waveform. This is significantly abnormal with reverse flow, as you see here. Gestational age, again, when you look at the predictors of prenatal outcome in early onset fetal growth restriction, we talk about the importance of the gestational age. Until about 27, 28 weeks, you should keep those pregnancies until the last moment because of the importance of the gestational age effect. Some studies show that the ductus venosus is really important somewhere between the 27 and 29, 30 weeks. The MCA did not show the impact perinatal outcome in several studies. Now, if you look at the predictors of perinatal outcome in early onset fetal growth restriction, there is no value for ductus venosus in fetal growth restriction greater than 32 weeks. And that's clear. You should not be doing ductus venosus after 32 weeks, rely on other parameters. Going along the same effect of the ductus venosus, of what we've done for the umbilical artery, an absent or reversed A wave in the ductus venosus has about 12-fold odds ratio for risk of fetal death. That is greater than neonatal mortality, certainly at 30 weeks, somewhere between 28 and 30 weeks. For reversed and diastolic, A wave in the ductus venosus, it's about 28 weeks. This data means that if you have reversed end diastolic velocity in the ductus venosus, you should seriously consider bailing out somewhere around 28 to 29 weeks. And if you have just absent, then you should consider bailing out around 30 weeks. So let me go through the truffle trial, because that's really an important trial that has really looked at the value of ductus venosus in management of early onset fetal growth restriction. So here you see their inclusion criteria: abdominal circumference less than 10 percentile, and the presence of abnormal Doppler. This is the gestational age window, so we're talking about early onset. Pregnancy outcome was survival without cerebral palsy, or doing the Bain 3 developmental score greater than 85 at 2 years of age. They randomized their patients into 3 categories, relying on cardiotocography, that is computer read, looking at short-term variability, or bailing out because of early onset ductus venosus changes here when the PI is greater than 95%, or bailing out if you have absent or reverse flow in the A. And this is what the study was. 542 women were eligible. There were 511 randomized. The first group allocated to keeping the pregnancy until you see changes in the short-term variability. Group 2 is looking at abnormal ductus venosus with greater than the 95th percentile, the PI. And Group 3 looking at absent or reverse flow in the ductus venosus. And you can see on initial take, intact survival included all death in here, and overall 82% survived, and there was no difference between the 3 groups. But when they did a secondary analysis, which was predetermined, and intact survivor corrected for prematurity, it appeared, as you can see here, that pregnancies that were allocated to delivery based on absent or reverse flow in the ductus venosus actually did better. 95% of them had intact survival without any immunological abnormalities that was pre-specified in the plan for the study. So the conclusion that in the absence of pathologically low short-term variability, delivery should be undertaken for absent or reverse ductus venosus in the A wave. And that was the basis, the study, for incorporating ductus venosus in the management of early onset fetal growth restriction. So the question now, should we do that in the United States for the management of early onset fetal growth restriction? And here I would say caution in doing this for the following reasons. First of all, the ductus venosus in the truffle trial was compared to computer-read cardiotocography. That computer-read cardiotocography, which has the ability to read short-term variability, is not FDA approved in the United States. So when you design a study looking at computer read of cardiotocography versus ductal stenosis, and you extrapolate the results to visual read based on human read, I think you have to be very careful because the results should not apply directly to that, to what we do in the US. But more importantly, I believe, if you look at the patients that were allocated to the ductal stenosis with absent or reverse flow, 33% of deliveries in late ductal stenosis group included cutoffs on the cardiotocography that are impossible to identify with the naked eye. So that speaks to the importance of the cardiotocography in designing the study. But then how really is important the ductal stenosis and management of early onset fetal growth restriction? I will tell you this is a very rare event. We have a very busy service of fetal growth restriction, and very rarely we see abnormalities in the ductal stenosis with absent and reverse flow. Even when you have umbilical artery absent and reverse flow, only 25% will show late changes in the ductal stenosis. And if you go back to the truffle trial, and you see of all the pregnancies allocated to ductal stenosis, you will see that 37 of the 337 were delivered due to ductal stenosis changes. That's only 11%. Why? Because the others were delivered due to preeclampsia, hypertensive complications, due to thresholds that were built for cardiotocography abnormalities. So when you incorporate ductal stenosis in your management, keep in mind that it will impact your delivery in a very small percentage of patients. For all these, and even the authors of the studies themselves, of the ductal stenosis, when they were posed the question, my hospital does not use computerized CPG, can I use normal CPG? And the answer, we do not recommend this, because the study was designed with computerized CPG, and you cannot extrapolate the data to the use of normal CPG to mean the visual read of the CPG. So because of all these findings, we recommend not to incorporate ductal stenosis Doppler as part of a national guideline for clinical management of fetal growth restriction in the United States, primarily because we do not have available to us the computerized CPG, and also because of how I've highlighted how rare it is for the ductal stenosis to become abnormal. Now, in MFM practices that wish to incorporate ductal stenosis in clinical management and have the expertise of interpreting these curves and these results, we recommend that you use ductal stenosis in refining your delivery planning somewhere between 28 and 32 weeks. And I think that is, the role is important for the use of ductal stenosis if you use it. Now, how about with the cerebral artery Doppler in early onset? I will summarize it quickly by saying there's a lot of studies that have been done and shows that even though we see a lot of abnormal with the cerebral artery Doppler, has limited predictive accuracy and does not really impact management and fetal growth restriction. Even when the truffle studies, when they went back and looked at the NCA Doppler, it showed that it did not really add useful information for clinical management. So with this data, we recommend against the use of the NCA Doppler in clinical management of early onset fetal growth restriction until more data really highlights the importance of this specific Doppler. In late onset fetal growth restriction, as I've mentioned, the umbilical artery is commonly normal. The abnormality in the NCA Doppler is noted in up to 20-25% of those pregnancies. CPR, which is the ratio of the middle cerebral artery to the umbilical artery, has been shown to predict morbidity, but we don't have strong evidence today that incorporating NCA or CPR in clinical management improves outcome. And I think there's a randomized study that's planned in Europe to try to assess the importance of this element here. How about biophysical profile? There's a word of caution on biophysical profile because first of all, there is a high prevalence of equivocal and false negative biophysical profile in early onset fetal growth restriction. And I think that's a caution. There's a handful of studies that have shown that. So you have to be careful not to use biophysical profile without incorporating cardiotocography in it because of this fairly high false negative rate and equivocal rate. And the United Kingdom, today I think they're working on revising their guidelines, recommend against the use of biophysical profile in early onset fetal growth restriction. So it's not validated by larger studies. Fetal deterioration appears to be independently reflected by Doppler and biophysical profile testing. Biophysical profiling may still play an important role in fetal surveillance and fetal growth restriction. So I think what I would suggest to do, if you're doing biophysical profiles, continue doing them, but make sure you have an element of non-stress test involved in that, because the pathways of deterioration not only is limited to Doppler, but could be limited to fetal heart rate tracing. So there are multiple pathways leading to disease. Now, how about peri-viable fetal growth restriction? We get a lot of pregnancies, as you know, with estimated fetal weight, or gestational ages of 24, 25, 26 weeks with severe fetal growth restriction, spontaneous decelerations and so forth. How to manage those pregnancies? Keep in mind that it's really important to note that neonatal mortality increases 2 to 4 folds in fetal growth restriction. So when you are talking about, if you look at this data, the intact survival in this study is at 24 weeks, 0%, 13% at 25 weeks, 31% at 26 weeks. So there is about a 2-week lag in fetal growth restriction fetuses versus what we traditionally recognize premature birth with regards to mortality. So there are challenges here, but I think 26 weeks and over 500 grams estimated weight seems to be an important cutoff for intervention. However, decisions to intervene earlier than that should really include a multidisciplinary approach with comprehensive counseling, including maternal-fetal medicine, neonatology, and the patient's input in making decisions with those extreme onset fetal growth restriction because of the complications related to survival and so on. So we recommend delivery in fetal growth restriction. Maternal indications, certainly hypertension is big here, spontaneous repetitive late decelerations, comorbidities or oligohydramnios at 34 to 37 weeks, severe fetal growth restriction when it is uncomplicated at 37 weeks. And that is based on the data that shows that the risk of IUFD starts to increase substantially around 37 weeks for pregnancies with estimated fetal weight less than the 3rd percentile. So, delivery indications overall at 38 to 39 weeks, if the estimated fetal weight is between 3 to 9%, at 37 weeks, when you have abnormal umbilical artery Doppler, but still with forward flow, or your estimated fetal weight is less than the 3rd percentile as stated, with absent end-diastolic velocity in the umbilical artery at 33 to 34 weeks, reverse end-diastolic velocity in the umbilical artery at 30 to 32 weeks. And there's some controversy on this, but we recommend to deliver by cesarean section for reverse flow in the umbilical artery because of the significant association with complications during labor, with I think a cesarean section rate of 80% or so if you start labor in those pregnancies. So I want to stop here. Just before I finish, I want to actually show you an algorithm. So your entry diagnosis here is estimated fetal weight less than a tenth, or an abdominal circumference less than a tenth. You should subclassify fetal growth restriction into early versus late, as you see here, and severe for estimated fetal weight less than a third. Workup is detailed obstetric ultrasound, genetic testing for early onset fetal growth restriction, presence of any sonographic markers or fluid abnormalities. CMV, consider CMV serologies. It appears to be important in a handful of patients with severe fetal growth restrictions. Then rely on the umbilical artery Doppler and cardiotocography in management. Certainly you deliver any time for the presence of repetitive late decelerations, post-fetal viability, and that's a decision that should be determined locally based on your NICU involvement, patient feedback, and so on. If your umbilical artery Doppler is normal, with the estimated fetal weight greater than the 3rd percentile, use umbilical artery Doppler between 2 to 4 weeks, non-stress test 1 to 2 times per week, and repeat estimated fetal weight every 3 to 4 weeks. Deliver at 3 weeks. If the estimated fetal weight less than the 3rd percentile, you deliver at 37 weeks. If you have abnormal umbilical artery Doppler, but still with forward flow, we recommend weekly Doppler, twice weekly non-stress test, estimated fetal weight every 2 weeks, and deliver at 37 weeks. If you have absent end-diastolic velocity in the umbilical artery, here, consider inpatient admission, umbilical artery Doppler 2 to 3 times per week, steroids certainly, CTG daily, and deliver at 33 to 34 weeks. If you have reverse flow in the umbilical artery, inpatient admission for sure, corticosteroids, CTG 1 to 2 times per day, and deliver at 30 to 30 minutes. I think this gives you an overview of the management of fetal growth restriction. As I stated today, we do not recommend the use of ductus venosus in the management for the reasons that I've highlighted. And also, we need more data to recommend the middle cerebral artery and hoping to get data to show that not only it identifies high-risk pregnancies, but certainly improves outcome of those pregnancies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Kính thưa quý vị đại biểu, theo chương
Tử cung ở quý ba, Long dịch lại các thầy chị hết.
Good morning, Prof. Thank you so much for your amazing lectures. So we have learned a lot today. So we know that you have received the very big funding for the government to study on placenta expansion. But the thing today is you want to know about the prediction of fetal growth restriction. So she has 3 questions. The first question is how to do the fetal growth restriction screening in the first trimester. The second question is in how we can do the fetal growth restriction screening in the third trimester. Because in some settings, for example in Europe or in the UK, they don't do the scan in the third trimester. So how we can screen for the small baby? And the third question is about the use-by Dopplers, use-by artery Dopplers. So how is the role of use-by artery Dopplers in terms of screening for and management for fetal growth restriction? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm honored to participate in the meeting, and I want to thank Dr. Hato for the kind invitation. Always a pleasure for me to be part of this exceptional course. First, with regards to the uterine artery Doppler, as you know, there are studies that have shown that the uterine artery Doppler has some predictive value for fetal growth restriction. And indeed, it is included in the definition of fetal growth restriction that is performed by the Delphi procedure, Delphi methodology that was done and now endorsed by ISWA. The problem with the uterine artery Doppler in the first trimester is that the predictive value is not very high, unlike its prediction for preeclampsia. And meta-analysis have shown that the predictive value is somewhere around 25% of fetal growth restriction, unlike its more predictive value in preeclampsia. Also, if you look, there are studies that have been done by Dr. Nicolaides that looked at what is the value of adding the uterine artery Doppler to the estimated fetal weight in the prediction of fetal growth restriction, or SGA. And the studies have shown that the uterine artery Doppler does not add much to the estimated fetal weight in the prediction of fetal growth restriction. So in the United States, we have decided not to include the uterine artery Doppler for screening for fetal growth restriction because of these findings. Now, in management, there is not enough data to support the role of the uterine artery Doppler in the management of fetal growth restriction. Most of the studies have been done to look at the prediction. I don't think there's any society that recommends to use the uterine artery Doppler in managing fetal growth restriction. I think maybe in the prediction, the ISWA guidelines recommend uterine artery Doppler as one of the criteria for the Delphi methodology, but certainly not in the management of fetal growth restriction.
Cái câu thầy đầu tiên thầy xin cảm ơn cô học của mình đã có lời mời và thầy rất là vinh dự được có mặt trong cái buổi hội thảo ngày hôm nay. Thì để trả lời cái câu thứ nhất về cái vấn đề là độc lực cái vòng tử cung, thì hiện nay có rất là nhiều bằng chứng cho thấy rằng là cái độc lực tử cung nó có giá trị trong cái việc dự báo. Và hiện nay thì chúng ta cũng đang người ta đang sử dụng nhiều cái đồng thuận đèn pin trong cái việc chẩn đoán. Thì ở quý 1 thì rất nhiều cái nghiên cứu cũng đã cho thấy rằng là mặc dù là nó có giá trị, tuy nhiên thì giá trị của nó không có cao, nó khoảng rơi vào khoảng 20%, nó tương tự như là cái sản vật. Và một cái nghiên cứu từ nhóm tác giả của Nicolaitis thì thấy rằng là việc khi mà chúng ta kết hợp thêm cái Doppler động mạch tử cung thì nó không làm tăng nó không làm cải thiện được cái khả năng chẩn đoán trong cái mô hình của sàng lọc thai chậm tăng trưởng. Vì vậy với những cái bằng chứng đó hiện nay tại Mỹ thì người ta không sử dụng cái Doppler động mạch tử cung là vì lý do như vậy. Và thầy cũng thấy rằng là hiện nay đa số các cái hiệp hội trên thế giới thì người ta không sử dụng cái Doppler động mạch tử cung trong việc xử lý các cái trường hợp thai chậm tăng trưởng. Ron, do you want to have any comment? So I complete the translation.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm waiting for the next question.
Okay. Thầy giờ cái câu hỏi tiếp theo.
Xin mời bác sĩ Hà Tuấn. Ban tổ chức chuyển micro. Có micro. Xin mời bác sĩ Trung Hoàng.
Hello. Dạ, xin cảm ơn bài báo cáo của giáo sư. Xin được hỏi 3 câu hỏi. Thứ nhất đó là thầy nhấn mạnh về vấn đề giá trị chẩn đoán thụ thai. Tuy nhiên giữa nhà lâm sàng và siêu âm đôi khi còn có sự chưa thống nhất. Về lâm sàng đa số các hiệp hội và phác đồ thì đều ghi nhận là cái thụ thai chẩn đoán chính xác nhất là từ 7 đến 8 tuần. Nhưng theo các nhà siêu âm thì thường lấy cái mốc 12 tuần. Thì theo quan điểm của thầy thì nên như thế nào, chọn mốc nào và lý do tại sao? Tại vì khi chúng ta quyết định chọn mà những cái điểm khác nhau sẽ ảnh hưởng đến thụ thai mà chúng ta sẽ ảnh hưởng và đánh giá là có chậm tăng trưởng hay không. Thứ hai là khi chẩn đoán bất thường của Doppler màu, chúng ta đã cho nhập viện vì kèm theo cái vách phân bị cân nặng nó thấp, thì chúng ta có nên làm lại Doppler khi chúng ta cho người bệnh nhập viện hay không? Bởi vì rất nhiều trường hợp đã được cho mua nhập viện thì tại phòng cấp cứu hoặc là tại phòng nhận bệnh người ta lại cho siêu âm lại Doppler trở về bình thường và không cho bệnh nhân nhập viện nữa. Thì quan điểm của giáo sư như thế nào? Cái thứ ba là có rất nhiều cái biểu đồ để chúng ta ước lượng cân nặng thai nhi để tính ra cho các phương vị. Quan điểm của giáo sư đã được nói rất là rõ rồi, nhưng mà có nên mỗi một quốc gia có nên có một cái công thức riêng để phù hợp với chính bản thân cái con người của đất nước đó hay không? Bởi vì nó có những cái đặc thù nào hay không để mà có thể ảnh hưởng đến cái việc quyết định chẩn đoán cái cân nặng này nó có bị thấp hay là cao. Xin cảm ơn.
Prof, he has 3 questions again. The first question is about how to determine the gestational age, because there's a consensus between the clinical doctors and radiologists about how to define the gestational age. Because majority of the doctors they use they base gestational age from 7 to 8 weeks, but for radiologists they always use at 12 weeks. So, what is your opinion? How to get the better and to get the optimal?
So in the United States, we use a combination of the patient's last menstrual period and if an ultrasound was done, whether the ultrasound is different or not. And the criteria we use, if the ultrasound is 5 days or more different, then the dates from the menstrual period, then we use the ultrasound up until 9 weeks. So 5 days until 9 weeks, and then 7 days from 9 weeks until the second trimester, until 20 to 22 weeks. These are the criteria that we use in the United States. 5 days up to 9 weeks. If there's difference of 5 days or more, we change. We assign the ultrasound. And we use 7 days discrepancy in the crown rump length or in the biometry until 22 weeks. Now, if you do ultrasounds and you are dating the pregnancy by ultrasound, this is acceptable also and a good method to do so. Probably the best time to do so is around 7 to 8 weeks to date the pregnancy, because the embryo is not curved at the time, and the crown rump length, if done appropriately, if you do 3 measurements and take the average of the 3, at around 7 to 8 weeks have a higher predictability than at 12 weeks. Because at 12 weeks there is some inaccuracy because of the curvature of the baby, and you may not actually measure the true crown rump.
Về câu hỏi đầu tiên của bác sĩ thì về cái vấn đề là thời điểm chuẩn đoán tuổi thai, thì theo ý kiến của thầy tức là nếu mà tại Mỹ thì người ta sẽ sử dụng là ngày kinh cuối cùng, và sau đó người ta sẽ siêu âm. Nếu mà được 7 tuần, được 9 tuần, nếu hai cái giá trị này nó trên nhau và đến 5 ngày thì người ta sẽ chọn là theo siêu âm. Còn nếu 5 ngày thì người ta vẫn tiếp tục sử dụng là last measurement, cái kinh cuối cùng. Còn nếu mà từ 9 tuần cho đến cái thời điểm 22 tuần thì nếu mà hai số này nó trên nhau trên 7 ngày thì người ta sẽ sử dụng siêu âm. Còn nếu dưới 7 ngày thì người ta vẫn tiếp tục sử dụng là cái ngày cuối cùng. Theo thầy thì cái thời điểm tốt nhất đó là cái thời điểm từ 7 đến 8 tuần. Lý do lúc đó là cái phôi thì nó không bị quá cong và nó không bị ảnh hưởng bởi cái tư thế, và chúng ta có thể đo một cách chính xác. Còn nếu thời điểm 12 tuần thì rõ ràng chúng ta bị biết rằng là cái thai nó có thể nằm ở những tư thế khác nhau, và cái độ cong của thai thì nó có thể thay đổi. Vì vậy mà theo thầy thì nên là sử dụng cái thời điểm là 7 đến 8 tuần. The second question is, if the baby has a small baby and then they have an abnormal doctor outside the hospital, and then they have the suggestion to admit the patient, and do we need to repeat the doctor after admission?
Yes, depending on what kind of doctor you have. I think it always makes sense to repeat the doctors, because if you are admitting a baby for absent and diastolic velocity in the umbilical artery, you want to see if there's any progression to reverse and diastolic velocity. Once you reach the level of reverse and diastolic velocity, you don't really need to repeat the doctor after that, because you are going to do cardiotocography, non-stress test maybe twice a day, and deliver at 30 to 32 weeks if there is no deterioration. So I think it's important to repeat the doctor if it is anything other than reverse flow, because that is another element of progression.
Cái câu hỏi thứ hai là liệu ta có nên bọc lại cái Doppler không hay nhập viện có hay nhập viện hay không? Thì theo thầy là tất nhiên là tùy thuộc loại Doppler nào. Nhưng mà nếu trong cái trường hợp thì theo thầy là tốt nhất là vẫn nên lọc lại cái Doppler. Trừ cái trường hợp mà nếu chúng ta thấy được có cái hiện tượng là đảo ngược sống với tấm trước của động mạch rốt, thì chúng ta không cần làm lại nữa. Lý do tại vì là chúng ta trong trường chúng ta làm lại để chúng ta thấy được ra sự cải thiện của cả cái Doppler như thế nào. Tuy nhiên đối với trong trường hợp mà đã đảo ngược rồi chúng ta nên làm cái CTC và hai lần một tuần, và chúng ta có lẽ phải cân nhắc cái việc là chúng thai kỳ cần còn sẽ từ 32 đến 39 tuần, ta không cần phải học lại nữa. The third question is, do you think that every country should have their own growth chart? Because there's some different between the ethnicity, every country. So what do you think about that?
So the data that exists today, and this has been now done in many countries, many localities, suggests that the Hadlock curve is the most optimum curve for estimation of fetal weight. Now, there was a large study that was done by Gross, and they evaluated several curves to see which one is best at predicting SGA and fetal growth restriction. And the Hadlock curve that was done, I think, in 1981 was the best one that is, and that's recommended to be used in Europe and in the United States. I don't have enough information on the population in Vietnam to see whether the Hadlock curve will have a better or less detection of growth restriction. I don't have information on that. But in Europe and the United States, now the recommendations are to continue to use the Hadlock curve, because studies have shown when it's compared to the intergrowth curve or compared to the NIH curve, the Hadlock curve performed better.
Cái câu hỏi là việc chúng ta hay sử dụng cái biểu đồ cân nặng đó của quốc gia hay không, thì thầy có một câu trả lời như thế này, tức là hiện nay chúng ta vẫn tiếp tục sử dụng cái Hadlock, cái bảng tiêu chuẩn của Hadlock là tốt nhất. Lý do là cái cách đây cũng khoảng tầm 1 năm, 2 năm thì về nghiên cứu từ cái rất này, tức là của Kipros Nicolaides, thì ông đã so sánh tất cả các cái chart giữa cái Hadlock và rất là nhiều cái bảng khác nhau, thì cái kết quả cho thấy rằng là cái Hadlock, cái bảng của Hadlock là nó có giá trị cao nhất trong cái việc sàng lọc cũng như là chẩn đoán các cái trường hợp phải nhập viện. Vì vậy thầy vẫn tiếp tục khuyến cáo sử dụng cái Hadlock cho cái đối tượng là dân số ở châu Âu và ở Mỹ. Ở Việt Nam hiện tại thầy chưa có đủ cái số liệu để nói rằng cái việc ứng dụng cái Hadlock là nó có cái cụ thể như thế nào và liệu như thế nào. Vì vậy thầy không thể đưa ra cái khuyến cáo cho Việt Nam được.
Mời bác sĩ Hà Tôn Linh, chắc là mình cũng chỉ thêm một câu hỏi nữa thôi.
Là cái câu hỏi của anh Hoàng đặt ra rất là đúng thực tế, có nghĩa là mình làm đốt lơ có bất thường nằm viện, sau đó thì lại bình thường, thì ý thầy ở đây muốn nhấn mạnh là cái đốt lơ nào, thì thực tế là các anh chị thấy cái đốt lơ nằm ở giữa nó rất là hay thay đổi, lúc bình thường rất bất thường, nhập viện vô thì nó trở về bình thường, cho nên là con có thể nói rõ với thầy, cho nên trong cái khuyến cáo của thầy là thầy không có đưa cái động mạch não nhiễu vào trong cái xử trí, mà chỉ hoàn toàn những cái đốt lơ động mạch rốn. Cho nên khi mà đặt câu hỏi đó thì thầy hỏi là cái đốt lơ nào thì
Dạ thưa cô ơi, cô hỏi lại câu hỏi cực kỳ hay.
Chắc có lẽ là cũng có nhiều câu hỏi quý đại biểu. Chúng ta sẽ có cái dịp mà chắc bệnh viện Từ Dũ cũng sẽ tổ chức lại cái hội thảo về cái chuyên đề này riêng, và chúng ta đã có clip của thầy rồi. Thì lúc đó các đại biểu có thể chia sẻ thêm kể cả cái việc là thảo luận cái ca lâm sàng. Còn thời lượng của hội nghị thì chắc có lẽ hôm nay thì chúng ta tạm dừng cái chủ đề này ở đây, bởi vì chúng ta còn cái chuyên đề thứ hai cũng rất là hấp dẫn.
So we stop the session. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the great meeting. Bye-bye.
Preterm labour really includes, again, 2 different cohorts. The first are babies that are born after the spontaneous onset of preterm birth, and the second is a cohort of women where they have preterm pre-labour rupture of membranes, and that then in turn leads to onset of labour. The third cohort, placenta insufficiency, includes things like fetal growth restriction, preeclampsia, and placental abruption. Obviously, these in themselves may lead to preterm delivery as well. So if we try and construct a antenatal model to assess risk in the early part of pregnancy for these 4 things, then I think both NIPT and combined first trimester screening can contribute to this. So this next slide just looks at the range of chromosomal abnormality that we might see during the course of a pregnancy. And you can see here that trisomy 21 is the commonest chromosomal problem, followed by trisomies 18 and 13. And typically in our screening, we've really concentrated on this 50% of the chromosomal abnormalities that could potentially be detected Things that are rarer include things called pathogenic CNVs, which we often recognise as microdeletions and microduplications. Things like sex chromosome aneuploidy, you can see is relatively common. And more rarely, I wanted to point out to you this little cohort here called rare autosomal trisomies. So aneuploidy screening has really changed quite dramatically over the last 50 to 60 years. If we went back to the mid-1960s, that's the time when it was first recognised that older women were at a slightly higher risk of having a baby that had a chromosomal abnormality. And interestingly, one of the things that's happened in most of our societies over the last 50 years is women are also having children at a later age, and therefore, individually, they have higher risks of having children that have chromosomal abnormalities. As we've gone along, we recognised that there were signs of chromosomal abnormality on the 20-week scan. With Down syndrome, there were major markers such as cardiac abnormalities and the finding of duodenal and then minor markers, things like echogenic foci, hydronephrosis. We also, in the mid-1980s, recognised that a series of different placental markers were either increased or decreased in pregnancies that had Down syndrome. And this led to the development of what was described as the maternal serum screening double, triple, or quadruple test. Then we have the advent of first trimester screening with the ultrasound marker of nuclear translucency and using the biomarkers pre-beta-HCG and PAP-A. And then there was a further development with first trimester ultrasound using additional ultrasound markers such as the nasal bone, looking at the ductus venosus waveform and looking for tricuspid regurgitation. But really, all of these are now being challenged by the development of the tests of NIPT. So, just a recap of the two major tests that we're focusing on. This is a first trimester scan, 12-week fetus. You can see this fetus has increased nuchal translucency. Also, if you look at the facial profile here, there should be a little bone here, just at the top of the nose, and this is missing. So this baby also has an absent nasal bone, and this baby has Down syndrome. If we look at how combined first trimester screening works, most people use the ultrasound marker of nuchal translucency, which you can see in the image here, together with the biomarkers serum beta-HCG and PAP-A, and you can see that HCG goes up in Down's pregnancies and PAP-A goes down in Down's pregnancies. And these are then based onto a risk analysis that is based on maternal age-related levels of risk. And when you use these four components together, you can basically define a high-risk group. The high-risk group is about 5% of the population, and that will include about 90% of Down babies. So that's actually been a pretty good test that has now been in use for about 20 years. Then we come to a genomic method, which is based around isolation of cell-free fetal DNA from the maternal circulation. So when we use this method, we first take a blood sample and then we separate the blood sample into different parts. And most of these tests rely on what's called a plasma to isolate cell-free DNA. And you can then use a different range of tools. Some of them are what we call shotgun sequencing. Some of them could be an array-based process. Some of them are pure counting tests. Others actually do a little bit more in terms of looking at the DNA sequence by looking at what we call SNPs. But if you just look at how these tests perform overall, then you can see that they really are a level of efficacy better than combined first trimester screening. So instead of a 90% detection rate, we now have about a 99% detection rate for the major trisomies, and instead of a 5% false positive rate, we now have less than a 0.1% false positive rate. So this is obviously a significant improvement on where we've been in the past. So the next problem is, which of these tests should we do? Should we just replace combined first trimester screening with this test? The problem with that is that the ultrasound scan in particular gives us a heads up on a whole variety of those different adverse outcomes that we discussed at the beginning of this talk. And in fact, in Australia, because combined first trimester screening was very effective and was picking up 90% of Down's babies, when the government come along and do what's called a cost effectiveness analysis, they found that for every additional case of Downs that we might detect using NIPT, we'd have to spend about $200,000. So this means, in fact, if you look at this from a societal or population perspective, it's not really, in our circumstance, a very cost-effective improvement to medical care. Another problem with the cell-free DNA screening is that there are circumstances where you don't get a result from this test. And in this big study that was published by Mary Norton in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015, that included about 18,000 women, 3% of those women did not have a reportable test. So that was 488 of the women involved. And if you actually then focused on that little cohort, you could find that about 1 in 38 of them actually had a chromosomal abnormality. And that level of 1 in 38 would typically be something that we would describe as being high risk. So, for example, they missed 3 Downs babies, 4 triploidy babies, and 1 trisomy 18, 2 trisomy 13, because they did not have a reportable NIPT result. So the paper originally described 100% detection rate of Downs, but if you actually include these missed cases, which were not reported in the population, it's more like a 93% detection rate. And their false positive rate was less than 0.1%. But on the other hand, if you define these no results as a false positive and someone who should have an amnio, then your false positive rate is in fact about 3%. And that makes a very significant difference to your positive predicted value. So I really think if we want to adopt NIPT across our population, we have to be focusing on some of the added benefits that the test has above and beyond combined first trimester screening. And I think that these are twofold. The first is using this for screening within twins. And we can do this for 2 reasons. One is to focus on better screening efficacy for aneuploidy, but the other is to look for chorionic problems. And then the other issue is to do extended screening looking for sex chromosome problems, common microdeletions, and rare autosomal trisomies. So just focusing on twins for a moment, we know that twins have significant additional risks compared to singles and pregnancies. And indeed, if we compare monochorionic twins to dichorionic twins, then in fact, these are the pregnancies that are most significantly at risk. And you can see that this slide shows you that the monochorionic risk of miscarriage, perinatal death, fetal growth restriction, and preterm delivery is at least double. And in the case of miscarriage or pregnancy loss before 24 weeks, 6 times higher than it is in the dichorionic counterpart. And you can see that most of the losses occur in the first part of pregnancy, so before about 22 weeks of gestation. Then there's a plateau, the loss rate doesn't increase much through the 3rd trimester until after about 35 or 36 weeks, when there's another small increase in the loss rate. So ultrasound is a key to determining what we call chorionicity. And this slide just shows us here 2 placentas next to each other, but they are separate placentas, and there's a body of tissue that comes up in the membrane between the 2 twins, and this is called the lambda sign. And this shows us that this is a dichorionic, diamniotic pregnancy at a lower level of risk. Down here, we have a monochorionic twin pregnancy, and here again it's diamniotic. You can see the 2 amniotic sacs, But now we've got a very thin membrane. We don't have a bulge of tissue that comes up that membrane. This is a monochorionic situation. So this is the type of pregnancy that has increased level of risk. Now, ultrasound can't define zygosity, but it can potentially define chorionicity, particularly if this scan is done at about 12 weeks, where this sign is about 97% effective. So in our population, about 2% of women have a twin pregnancy. First, a scan at 12 weeks is useful to make that diagnosis, but second, it's very important to help us then define chorionicity. Now, the problem with a twin pregnancy is because you've got two babies, you effectively end up with a higher overall risk of having one or at least one baby affected by chromosomal abnormality. And a typical 35-year-old would now, a typical 31 or 30-year-old would now have the risk of a 35-year-old just because of the fact that they have two twins, and therefore two levels of risk. And the knock-on effect of that is it means that in Australia, about 27% of women are over the age of 35, and on the basis of age would be defined as being high risk. But if you take the same level of risk in a twin population, it means that about 63% of women, if you just use that simple method of risk assessment, would now be defined as high risk. So combined first trimester screening has been used by a number of different groups to predict risks of twins and seems to perform reasonably well. You can see the early study, 75% detection rate of Downs for a 9% false positive rate. You can see by adding the biochemical markers, we can get that up to about a 90% detection rate for Downs and also reduce that false positive rate. And then adding other ultrasound markers like the nasal bone, again, improvement in the detection rate for a fixed 5% false positive rate. So the markers that we have, if we use them in combination in a twin pregnancy, it seems to perform fairly similarly to the way combined first trimester screening performs in symptoms. Can we be certain of chorionicity? Well, there's a variety of tests that I think are useful for that. We've sort of talked about that already. But certainly, if we know that we have a monochorionic situation, for example, we know that lupus might be increased with that. And so chorionicity essentially can have an impact on your risk assessment for aneuploidy. And similarly, if we use the ductus venosus, again, it can be related to twin transfusion or cardiac abnormalities, which are common in monochorionic situations. And so the reverse airway might not be indicative of aneuploidy, but more likely indicative of an inherent twin complication. NIPT has been used in twins. You can see that the detection rates seems fairly good for Downs, perhaps a little lower than that described in singletons for trisomies 18 and 13. The data is in part impacted by the fact that there's far less data for twins than there is for singleton pregnancies. Now, let's just turn and look at this from another way. So, when we do NIPT using a counting test, so this is an example on the left-hand side, what we're trying to do is count fragments of chromosome 21 in comparison to a reference chromosome to show if there's Downs, an extra fetal component to all of these fragments of of chromosome 21. Now, just to give you an idea, this difference is very small, and this publication from 2011 showed that you need to count about 7 million bits of DNA in order to be able to distinguish these cases with chromosomal abnormality accurately from the normal range. And you can see that when you have fewer counts, then the standard deviation from the mean is slightly higher than when you have 7 million counts. This also meant that we're completely reliant on the proportion of fetal fraction for the total column. And so you can see finally on the right-hand side that as the fetal fraction reduces, it really plays back to the normal range. And so when you get a fetal fraction below about 4%, it was in fact very difficult to define risks for chromosome abnormality. And that's one of the reasons why you get those low results. The problem in twins is that if you use a simple counting technique, then in fact what you're doing is counting the whole fetal fraction of both babies and not distinguishing between the two. And this just gives you an example of this graph on the right hand side. And you can see here, in fact, there was a low fetal fraction for twin A, but because the fetal fraction of twin B is quite high, you would never actually know that you haven't seen the high fetal fraction for either one of the twins. And just to show you what the impact of that is, when you're talking about risks and risk reduction using the negative likelihood ratio, if you have a high fetal fraction above 10%, you can see that you get a 10,000-fold risk reduction for Downs. But if you've got a very low fetal fraction, it might only be a 3-fold reduction in risk. And so it's actually really important, in my mind, that you're able to determine fetal fraction accurately for both twins separately. And in my mind, there's only one way that you can do this, and that is to use a SNP-based form of NIPT. So I would suggest you look out for that type of test specifically for twins. This is the example of the changes in pattern that you get using a SNP-based test in monozygotic twins, where there's Down syndrome. And this is an example in a dizygotic twin pair, in a dichorionic twin pregnancy. And the reason that I wanted to also show you this about the SNPs is that if you have not identified chorionicity using ultrasound in early pregnancy, then this is in fact a valuable means of helping to define zygosity and therefore to try and identify chorionicity through later pregnancy. So let's go in a different direction. If we're going to use NIPT, I suggested that we could also extend the things that we were screening for. I'm not going to talk about sex chromosomes. I'm going to concentrate on other forms of aneuploidy. But I just wanted to show you relative prevalence. So you can see that Downs is the commonest form of chromosome abnormality. In fact, the second is deletion of 22q11. The other microdeletions in comparison are quite uncommon. And in most populations, you'll find that deletion of 22q11 probably makes up over 50% of all the deletions that you can see. Now, I question the value of screening for a whole range of different deletions and for rare autosomal transfers, because these conditions are all really, really rare. And actually, there is a lot of counselling, I think, that you need to do pre-test, and I've purposely just described what I think you need to say about each of these conditions. But the writing is obviously very small because there's a lot to say, and I think that this is not really a range of tests that it's easy to counsel someone for properly pre-NIPT. So I think if I was going to add any additional test at the time of NIPT, it would be purely for deletion of 22q11. Some people are using a low-pass whole genome shotgun sequencing approach to being able to look for other rare autosomal transfers. But let me just point out to you that these are almost universally confined to the placenta. And it's only really the orange little tips here that potentially show true mosaicism. And in my mind, with the exception of mosaic trisomy 16, this is really irrelevant. So again, I think if you're going to choose a test that allows you to extend the range of aneuploidy you're screening for, I personally would not focus on rare autosomal trisomies. I'd much rather have an accurate test for 22q11. So 22q11 is an important chromosome abnormality. We've seen the prevalence already. We can see that there's a number of cardiac abnormalities that are described in association with this, as well as other structural abnormalities that's also associated with IUGR polyhydramnios. And perhaps more importantly, there's a number of neurodevelopmental disorders that are associated with deletion of 22q11. And the graph on the left just shows that almost universally, children that have 22q11 have a reduction in their intelligence quotient And if you look at the IQ level, on average it's about 70, so that's actually about the same as a Down population, and significantly lower than the average of 100 in a normal population. So I think that these are very significant issues that parents need to be aware of, and that might lead them down the pathway of prenatal testing. At the moment, we're pretty poor at picking up these cases prenatally. Most of them are identified because we've seen a cardiac abnormality on the scan, or alternatively because of a finding of increased intratranslucency. So this is just an example of a fetus that has cardiac abnormality. This fetus has tetralogy of fallow, so there's a small VSD, there's an overriding aorta. Those are perhaps the features that are most obvious there, a slightly small pulmonary trunk as well. Interestingly, if you look anteriorly in the chest, there's apparently absence of thymus as well. And this fetus has a deletion of 22q11. So how can we use the screening test? Well, we've done some calculations over here as estimates using an assumption of a population of 100,000 people with a disease prevalence of about 1 in 2,000, where we assumed that the NIPT test would have a detection rate of 85% and would have about a 0.25% screen positive rate. And if we set those criteria, you can see that if we screen the whole population, this middle line here, we would pick up most of the cases of 22q11, but the positive predictive value is only about 1 in 5 of those that are identified. So really, we need a test that has a higher detection rate and a lower false positive rate, really to fit the paradigm of trying to have a very efficacious method of testing for population screening. So when we're looking for a population-based cohort, just to summarise again, we're looking for a test that has a high detection rate and a lower screen positive rate. Now, one of the problems with screening is the size of the deletion. So you can see here that typically what happens when you have a deletion is on the basis of the gene coding, you'll get the deletion occurring at one of these 4 different locations. So you'll end up with a deletion that might be 3 megabase long or as short as 1.5 megabase long. And all of these are potentially important from a phenotypic perspective, but these short microdeletions are very, very difficult to see using pure counting technique for NIPT. So we've been involved recently in a study called the SMART study to look at detection of 22q11. This involved 21 different centres. We were the only Australian centre. The trial recruited 20,000 women, and we have postnatal karyotypes on nearly 90% of those. And this is using the panorama test, so this trial was essentially paid for by Natera. So the study was designed so we could look for deletions of 22q11, and the SNP methodology was used so we could look for each of these major types of deletions. So we'd be able to assess all of the deletions that were bigger than about 500 kilobase pairs. And what we found was about 15% of individuals, or what was believed at the beginning of the trial, was about 15% of individuals would have a short deletion. Now this just shows you some of the outcome data. So the first thing is that this uses a slightly different method of predicting risk of trisomies using an artificial intelligence process. And it showed very high levels of sensitivity and specificity for the 3 major trisomies. So just confirm that the test works well for these typical chromosomal abnormalities. If we then focus on the ability to actually screen without false positive or a no call, then you can see that using the AI program actually reduced the false positive rate and the no call rate quite significantly. Then what I wanted to do is concentrate on the 22q11, and you can see here, first that in fact we had many more short deletions than expected, about 42% rather than 15%. And also actually the prevalence of 22q11 was much higher than before, more like 1 in 1,500 than 1 in 2,000 pregnancies. But importantly, the sensitivity of the test was very high, about 85%, and even more importantly, the specificity of the test was much higher than had previously been seen, so it's a 0.05% false positive rate, and that meant that the positive predictive value is much higher than we've previously achieved, which is great news in the context of screening those populations. So I just wanted to focus on a comparison between ultrasound and then NIPT, 22q11. And you can see that a number of these pregnancies did have a first trimester scan, but certainly that wasn't universal across all centres. In fact, the first trimester scan was almost universally reported to be normal in these cases. Later, 1 or 2 of them were found to have cardiac abnormality, another had a renal anomaly. You can see that there were other cardiac abnormalities that were seen in the second trimester as well. So that brings me to the value of the first trimester scan outside of chromosome abnormality, now looking at major structural abnormalities. And here you can see that CNS anomalies, cardiac abnormalities, renal abnormalities are all very similarly placed in the context of how common they are. Overall, about 3% of cases will have a structural abnormality. So this just shows you data going back to 1997, using first trimester ultrasound to predict whether there's a congenital structural abnormality, and generally as time has gone on we've improved, and at the moment we will pick up about 45% of these at the time of the first trimester scan. Nuchal translucency remains important. You can see, as well as being predictive for abnormal karyotype, is predictive of fetal death and major structural abnormalities. And if we add nuchal translucency to the other markers also developed originally for antibody tricuspid regurgitation, ductus venosus abnormalities, then these are actually all synergistic. So if we use all 3 of them together, we do actually get very high detection rates of cardiac abnormalities using these 3 tools. You can see there is 75% detection rate using the 3 markers. So this is just giving you an example of a couple of cardiac abnormalities, because I also just wanted to reinforce the fact that although we can just screen using nuchal translucency and the other markers, really these days what we should be doing is looking at the heart. So for example, I'll just focus on this one on the left-hand side. You can see here, this fetus has a small AVSD. You can see the valves, the AV valves are running, abutting each other, and you can see the defect just at the crux there. This is all now visible at 12 weeks, providing you. We already identified that looking for CNS abnormalities is very important. Again, there are really 3 major abnormalities, and all of these can be identified at 12 weeks. Anencephaly, because of absence of the cranium, polar prosencephaly, where you can see absence of the faults of the midline differentiation of the brain, and then spina bifida. And spina bifida is best determined by looking in this mid-sagittal view, where you can see the brain stem, and you can also see the foreventricle and the cisterna magna. They're roughly similar sizes here. In this case, you can see how the cisterna magna and foreventricle are collapsed, and you get this enlargement of the brainstem. And these are the types of features that we would be looking for that help us identify spina bifida. One German prospective study recently showed that they could pick up about 90% of these cases using a 12-week scan. And we're never going to be able to do this using an NIPT test. I think rather than go through all structural anomalies that we can see at 12 weeks, let me just point to one but I think at 12 weeks it's actually more likely that we might pick it up than at 20 weeks, and that is screening for cleft palate. So here you can see a normal palate on the left-hand side. You can see this slightly triangular shape that we get with the bone in the midline, and then here you can see a defect in the middle of the palate there, and again here on this fetus on the right-hand side. So I think we're also now beginning to see markers at 12 weeks that might allow detection of anomalies that in fact have been very difficult to detect throughout pregnancy. There are good guidelines that define how you should do a structural assessment at 12 weeks. This is the guideline of the International Society of Ultrasound and Gynae, and it just demonstrates how you should go through the fetus in a sequential fashion, looking at each system. Here you can see the head, face, neck, spine, and the views that are described, and then we move on to the heart, chest, abdomen, abdominal wall, extremities, and then don't forget to look at the placenta and the cord insertion. So finally, how do we screen for other adverse pregnancy outcomes that are also responsible for significant rates of perinatal mortality and morbidity? Well, preeclampsia is a good example of this because of the staged manifestation of the disease. So many of the women that get early onset preeclampsia have that secondary to placental dysfunction. And what first happens is changes within both the placenta and the maternal vascular endothelium. And then later we see end organ damage, which is associated with the investigational findings that we see that we associate with preeclampsia, things like hypertension and proteinuria. So here we have an opportunity to try to intervene to recognize the first stage of this process and then try to impact that with a treatment that will prevent continued development to the second stage of this disease. So here we can predict early preeclampsia using the algorithm VFAP2021 at 12 weeks, measuring uterine artery Doppler, mean arterial pressure, and the biomarkers PLGF and or PAP-A. And she showed a 90% prediction of cases of early onset preeclampsia before 12 weeks. And using things like uterine artery Doppler on the 12-week scan, I think that we should now routinely include this with all of our 12-week scans. We have shown that we can validate the owner's algorithm here in Australia, so if we concentrate on the left side of this, the early preeclampsia, we have about a 90% prediction rate for 10% false positive rate, very similar to the work of the owner and the colleagues. So what's the treatment? Well, for high-risk women, we give aspirin to then prevent them developing preeclampsia later on. On the left-hand side, there's a series of meta-analyses that are showing how if you give aspirin at an early stage, you can reduce the risk of preeclampsia, fetal growth restriction, and perinatal death. And on the right-hand side, you see our own observations from our own data set. Early preeclampsia, we've seen about a 90% reduction in the high-risk group that we identified from the 12-week scan. We also recently published a paper that shows the cost effectiveness of this. So by screening, we managed to avoid a significant number of cases of preeclampsia. We've reduced the total cost of admissions, primarily through a reduction in neonatal admission prematurity, and we have saved a significant amount of money by screening at 12 weeks. So obviously screening itself costs money, but that is then offset by the savings that we make in the outcomes for neonates and reduction of neonates that are delivered preterm. The different orange dots show the sensitivity analysis, and we don't have a single analysis that actually makes this a more expensive process. So where do we go next? Well, we're still developing models for preterm birth. This is an example of a model using cervical length and serum AFP in the first trimester. Perhaps not quite up to the standard that we want for these models, a 60% detection rate and 10% false positive rate. Similarly, we've developed a model for first trimester screening for preterm prelabor rupture membranes. Again, I think that this needs further improvement. But I think the fundamental message is you only identify what you're looking for. And if you restrict your first trimester process to use of an NIPT test, then for sure you'll do very well at identifying Down syndrome, but you won't necessarily identify all chromosomal abnormalities. And I think if you want to get the best out of first trimester screening, you need to use a combination of ultrasound, combined first trimester screening, and NIPT. And if you're interested on this picture, if you look hard enough, there are actually 18 tigers you need to see, but you're only going to see them if you look for them.
Giáo sư Tô Lâm Phan Hề là trình bày là rất hấp dẫn, một chủ đề không mới nhưng mà rất là nhiều cái mới, phối hợp ít và các biện pháp sản phẩm truyền thống trong 3 tháng đầu của thai kỳ. Tiếp theo sẽ là thảo luận. Do thời gian còn rất ít thì là đề nghị các quý vị đại biểu chúng ta đặt câu hỏi trực tiếp vào chủ đề.
Người nghỉ á, một người bắt đông đi không? Bắt đông đi không? Đúng rồi. Đó mới đi này.
Xin mời có micro ạ.
Chiều nữa đi nó bắt đi Hồ Nghị á. Có Hồ Nghị
Em có 2 câu hỏi muốn hỏi. Câu hỏi đầu tiên đó là đối với những trường hợp mà làm những ra ống nghiệm mà đã sàng lọc phôi tức là PCTA, thì trong cái giai đoạn đầu chúng ta đã sàng lọc một số tế bào của phôi từ cái chloroplast để mình tuyển phôi, thì với tiếp cận qua ban đầu khi mà mình sàng lọc thì liệu là chúng ta sẽ làm một siêu âm hình thái hay là chúng ta sẽ khảo sát sàng lọc trên đường quy, tức là cái đợt đáp một hết hoặc là làm NIPT. Câu hỏi thứ hai đó là đối với những trường hợp mà sinh nón thì theo kinh nghiệm của thầy và có các cái nghiên cứu báo cáo khi mà chúng ta sàng lọc qua 3 tháng đầu thì có sự khác biệt nào hay là lưu ý nào nếu như mà áp dụng NIPT trong các đối tượng này so với những trường hợp mà làm tự thân hay sinh hết.
Không nghe rõ không Long? Chắc hơi nhỏ không?
Thank you so much for your amazing lectures. We have two questions for you. So the first question is for the IVF pregnancy. When we do already PCTA before, and then, so what do you think if we can continue to do like the screen like routine care, or you do it in a different way? And the second question is when we get the offsite from another mother, so what you are going to do with this? Do we apply NIPT for this scenario?
I think that they're both excellent questions, so thank you. Let me start with the issue of the finding. So if you do pre-implantation genetic screening, that has been identified to detect the order of 95% of major chromosomal abnormalities. So essentially that means the a priori risk based on the maternal age when the embryo was
hiện nay có sự cố đường truyền, nếu như ban tổ chức thấy sự cố đường truyền không thể khắc phục được thì nhờ bác sĩ Hà Tuấn Nguyên trả lời câu hỏi.
Thì câu đầu tiên bạn hỏi là nếu mà mình đã chẩn đoán tiền cái phôi trong cuộc tin ống nghiệm, phải không ạ? Thì như vậy là các bạn biết rằng bây giờ những cái trường hợp mà trước khi đặt cái phôi vào thì mình đã chẩn đoán tiền cái phôi, có đang muốn trả lời. Xin mời bác sĩ Lan chứ.
Xin mời bác sĩ Ngọc Lan.
Thưa chúng tôi bạn, chúng tôi các anh chị các bạn đồng nghiệp, thì chắc có lẽ xin phép để trả lời cái câu hỏi là một của bạn nó liên quan về cái việc mà xét nghiệm di truyền tiền mạch tổ đối với phôi. Thì thật ra xét nghiệm di truyền tiền mạch tổ có ba cái loại. Loại thứ nhất đó gọi là PGTA, tức là một sàng lọc mà lệch nội, sàng lọc cái số lượng nhiễm sắc thể. Cái loại thứ hai đó gọi là PGT-SR, tức là sàng lọc cái cấu trúc của cái nhiễm sắc thể, bất thường cấu trúc nhiễm sắc thể. Và cái thứ ba là PGT-M, tức là sàng lọc những cái bất thường ở đơn gen, tức là đến cái cấp độ gen của trên nhiễm sắc thể. Thì câu hỏi của bạn á, là nếu mà mình đã làm sàng lọc cái phôi á, làm sàng lọc bất thường số lượng nhiễm sắc thể rồi, để là đã thấy rằng số lượng nhiễm sắc thể là bình thường rồi, thì khi á, mà mình đưa vô trong tử cung đó mà mang thai á, thì như vậy mình có cần phải làm sàng lọc quý 1 mà lệch nội cho làm hay không? Thì đó là câu hỏi của bạn. Thì chắc là xin trả lời như thế này. Thứ nhất á, là mình làm PGTA á, là mình lấy cái tế bào, là lấy cái tế bào ở cái lớp ngoại bì lá nuôi, chứ không phải lấy ở trong cái phôi. Do đó có khi nó không phản ánh thực sự cái tế bào ở trong cái phôi. Do đó nó có thể có dung tính giả, có âm tính giả. Hồi nãy ông thầy cũng đang nói giữa chừng đó là phát hiện được có 95% thôi, mà vẫn còn bỏ sót 5%. Cái đó là cái ý thứ nhất. Ý thứ hai là gì? Đôi khi nó có thể thảm, mà người ta vẫn sử dụng cái thể thảm, cái phôi thể thảm để mà chuyển phôi. Do đó mình vẫn cần phải làm cái chẩn đoán mà sàng lọc được bí mật như bình thường. Cái thứ ba, nó có thể có một cái hiện tượng nó gọi là RNA dropout, tức là không biểu hiện cái gen đó lên trong cái quá trình mà mình sàng lọc, thì như vậy nó gây ra một cái hiện tượng âm tính giả. Do đó tóm lại để trả lời câu hỏi thứ nhất, mặc dù làm PGTA trước khi chuyển phôi nhưng vẫn phải làm sàng lọc quý 1 như một cái là lịch trình bình thường. Xin hết.
Cảm ơn bác sĩ Lan rất nhiều, đang chẩn đoán trả lời rất là hay. Thầy cân nhắc lại được rồi đó, các bạn có ấy là được chưa? Thầy vào lại rồi. Thì Nguyên cũng xin bổ sung chút xíu là trong cái bài của thầy nhấn tới luôn là chúng ta phải kết hợp với siêu âm và NPT. Tại vì siêu âm nó sẽ bất thường những cái cấu trúc mà các bạn thấy là bây giờ những cái bất thường về cấu trúc ở quý 1 như thầy soi là từ tim cho đến nhận thần kinh trung ương mình đã chẩn đoán được. Tất nhiên là cần có người kỹ năng và đánh tốt, nhưng mà có thể đến 1/4 những cái dị tật đã phát hiện được ở mức 1. Thường là những dị tật lớn mình có thể tính đến 2 kỳ. Cho nên là nếu các anh chị thấy rằng bây giờ NPT khá là phổ biến ở Việt Nam, nhất là khi cái giá thành nó khá là rẻ, cho nên mình nên có một số hình thái, vì thai có những cái bất thường cấu trúc thì mình sẽ chờ để chọc ối suy nghĩ với nhau hơn là làm cái NPT. Nó sẽ tốn tiền cho bệnh nhân, mặc dù là nó rẻ nhưng mà nó cũng là mấy triệu. Cho nên các anh chị thấy là cái so quý 1 mình phối hợp nó còn rất là quan trọng, và chúng ta sẽ kết hợp tại vì nó sẽ là tối ưu như là thầy nhấn trong cái slide cuối. Thầy được việc.
Professor Lan has just replied the question. But do you want to have any comment?
Có trả lời câu này không hay là mình có tiếp để thầy trả lời hay là đặt câu hỏi khác không? Tại Lan thì đã trả lời xong cái ý đó rồi.
Nhưng mà hỏi Long coi thầy có trả lời không? Tại vì mình cũng hỏi thầy đã tôn trọng thầy.
Chị Long hỏi nói thầy có thể trả lời tiếp.
Professor Lan has just answered this question. Do you want to add any comment?
I'm very happy with the answer.
Thầy bảo là thầy happy ạ. Có thể chuyển vào câu hỏi khác.
Khi xin hỏi một câu là Nguyên muốn hỏi thầy cái những cái óc mà thầy khuyến cáo ở NIPT khi mà da cái dày đó, tại vì mình hay có xu hướng là NIPT mình hay đi làm dày, hay đi làm cái NIPT lắm, thì theo thầy thì thường dùng cái những cái óc nào cũng như là đến cái mức nào không nên làm mà nên làm suy nghĩ với nhau. Câu thứ hai là trong slide của thầy có nói nhiều về cái vấn đề sàng lọc năm 2011, thì tôi thấy rằng cái việc sàng lọc nó cũng có trách nhiệm và đó là một cái bệnh có cái tần suất khá thường gặp, thì cái NIPT nó có thể hữu hiệu. mà cái việc chẩn đoán cái những cái bất thường của 22/11 edition nó rất là khó trong siêu âm. Vậy thì thầy có khuyến cáo nếu bệnh nhân có khả năng thì có khuyến cáo để làm cái NIPT sàng lọc thường quy cho 22/11 hay không?
She has two questions for you. The first question is, what do you think about the cutoff or mutual translucency to offer NIPT? Any cutoff for that? Or you can do CBS for amniocentesis. The second question is, do you think that is a good idea to apply NIPT for screening for 22q11 division as a routine practice?
So 22q11 deletion is the second commonest chromosomal abnormality mutation. And I think that now that we have a SNP-based method of NIPT that has a very high diagnostic yield and a very low false positive rate, it makes a lot of sense to include this in an NIPT screening test.
Về câu hỏi thứ hai là thầy trả lời là cái virus đoàn 22q11 thì đây là một cái bệnh lý rồi là có cái tỷ lệ thứ hai trong các cái bất thường về thực thể. Và hiện nay chúng ta đã có một cái loại là NIPT dựa vào SNP, tức là SNP với cái khả năng chẩn đoán chính xác rất là cao và cái tỷ lệ dương tính rất là thấp. Vì vậy mà chúng ta có thể sử dụng cái NIPT để sàng lọc cái hội chứng là 22q11 deletion. So, want to move the next questions?
The answer to the question about MT cutoff is more complicated, I think. Certainly, I think you need to recognize that fetuses that have structural abnormalities and fetuses that have big nuchal translucency are quite likely or have a higher likelihood of having an atypical chromosomal problem that is not detected with traditional NIPT tests. So I certainly think there are a group of fetuses where you do a scan and you find an abnormality and that the test of choice is a CBS or amnio, not NIPT. What nuchal cutoff you use rather depends on how you want to maximize detection of other chromosomal problems versus how you want to minimize the number of invasive tests that you do. And although there is now data suggesting a 3mm cutoff rather than a 3.5mm cutoff, I think at this point the yield and the positive predictive value is better if you use a 3.5mm cutoff.
Về câu hỏi về cái cutoff của đối với thai gái thì đấy là một cái câu hỏi rất là phức tạp. Lý do là khi mà chúng ta có cái thai nhi có tăng đối với da gái, tức là da gái dày hoặc là có những cái bất thường cấu trúc thì thông thường nó liên quan rất là nhiều, tức là nó làm tăng nguy cơ một thai nhi có những cái bất thường về tập thể mà có lẽ là NIPT không thể phát triển ra được. Vì vậy trong những tin của mai theo thầy chúng ta nên làm CBS hoặc là nhập phổi. Và khi mà chúng ta muốn sử dụng cái cutoff của đối với da cái để mà làm các cái xét nghiệm chẩn đoán thì chúng ta cần phải cân bằng giữa hai yếu tố, đó là cái mức độ phát hiện và cái thứ hai đó là cái số lượng chúng ta phải làm các cuộc sống bệnh, tại vì nó liên quan đến rất nhiều các biến chứng cũng như là rất nhiều biến chứng cho thai kỳ.
hiện nay thì có một số nơi người ta sử dụng cái ngưỡng cất tóp khoảng 3 mm thay vì 3.5. thì theo thầy hiện nay thì vẫn nên sử dụng là 3.5 mm để cho chúng ta tức là để xác định hoặc là tức là tăng, tức là dây da tay và chúng ta có thể làm thêm các cái xét nghiệm chẩn đoán.
Chắc có lẽ là cái thời lượng của chương trình cũng đã có giới hạn, và hiện nay thì ban tổ chức báo là cũng đã hết thời gian thảo luận. Thì sau đây xin cảm ơn giáo sư rất là nhiều. Cảm ơn bác sĩ Long đã dịch rất là hay, truyền tải đầy đủ các nội dung. Sau đây thì mời ban tổ chức chúng ta tiếp tục chương trình.
Thank you so